Hello, heathens. Welcome back. Today I have Professor Erik Vanden Eykel with me. I'm super excited. Hello, hello, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I made Erik's acquaintance on Twitter, which I know will not shock most of you because that's how I've made so many people's acquaintance. For some reason, my colorful vocabulary attracts all kinds. And I'm fortunate that it's happened to attract a lot of really smart people that I then get to sit down with and have more serious academic-based conversations because I actually do really love that. So, like I said, thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and how you got here?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Erik Vanden Eykel. I specialize in early Christian literature, and I focus primarily on apocryphal literature, so non-canonical post New Testament stuff. And I'm really very interested in stories and traditions about the infancy of Jesus and his mother. Let's see. I live in Virginia, and I've lived here since 2014. And I teach at a small liberal arts college down here in Southwest Virginia called Ferrum College, a little United Methodist school. And before that, I lived in Milwaukee for 7 years or so. I did my PhD at Marquette. And so that's and I like to make friends and trouble on Twitter. So
I know a thing or
yeah,
two about that.
right.
So, I remember you saying once that you teach at this college or you teach teachers at this college?
I teach at this college.
You teach at
Yes.
this college. Okay, I think I just had a misunderstanding. Hard to imagine me understanding something on Twitter, but it does happen. Uh, so you said that you specialize in sort of apocryphal literature, especially when it comes to the infancy of Jesus. So if I have my memory serves, this would be something like the Gospel of Thomas?
Yeah. So there's the two different Thomases. So there's the Gospel of Thomas, which is just a list of sayings, and then there's the
Right, okay.
infancy Gospel of Thomas. Yeah, and so that's the one you're thinking of. So that was
Yes.
yeah. So that actually, I can't believe we're only like 2 minutes in. You've already mentioned the infancy Gospel of Thomas.
I like to get right
That
into it.
Oh yes, let's just jump in. So that was the infancy Gospel of Thomas was sort of like if I was going back to like chart how exactly I got from like an undergraduate who had no idea what he was doing to today, where I still don't really know what I'm doing, but I know how to take it. The infancy Gospel of Thomas, the infancy Gospel of Thomas was like a gateway drug for me. And so when I was in a New Testament class that I had to take as an undergrad, and our professor gave us this story of Jesus as a 5, 6 year old or whatever, like you know killing people and yelling at people and pushing people off of like roofs and things like this. And I just remember reading that as an undergrad and going, oh my God, like this is amazing. And our entire class we were sort of laughing all the way through it because I mean, murder is not funny, but also like the child Jesus like murdering his playmates because they messed something up is just fascinating. And so that was like in hindsight that was really what kind of triggered my interest in like I grew up Methodist and I grew up sort of knowing about the New Testament, but then all of a sudden my professor hands me this thing that's like, hey, people used to read this too, and it was just like I wonder what else is out there. Now it took me another probably 10 years to actually decide like this is what I work on. But yeah, infancy Gospel of Thomas. The text that I specialize in is called the Proto-Gospel of James, which is a
Okay.
lot less exciting than the infancy Gospel of Thomas, but it tells the story of Mary's conception and birth all the way up to the birth of Jesus.
Okay. So when do you know, or can you venture a guess as to when the infancy Gospel of Thomas was written?
Probably, I would say second or third century. So, probably like probably the latter, later, probably later second century, early third century. I would say probably.
And why, if you, I mean, obviously you probably don't know for sure, but like, why do you think something like this would have been written, right? Like, why would someone be interested in portraying the child Jesus as this sort of like psychopath? Or just...
Right, right. Well, and so my colleague Tony Burke, who teaches up at York in Canada, um, there's a there's a phrase that he uses in one of his articles where he says the author of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas portrays Jesus as a cursing wonder worker. I think that's what he calls him, like a cursing wonder worker, because he imagines that that's how Jesus actually was from the portraits that we have of him in the Gospels. And so, you think about, for example, like, Jesus, when he encounters the fig tree and he goes up to it and they, like, I think it's in Mark, right? And Mark's like, and it wasn't the season for figs, that's what Mark says. And then Jesus goes up to the fig tree and he finds that there's no figs on it, and then he curses it and then it dies. And so, like, this whole, I mean, and this is irrational, right? It's like going up to an apple tree in the dead of winter and then getting angry because there's no apples on it. Like, that's not apples.
Right.
So Jesus sort of has this irrational moment with the fig tree. He, loses his mind when he does the thing in the temple where he starts like driving people out and all this kind of stuff. In the Gospel of Luke, at the start, he kind of talks back to his parents when they leave him in Jerusalem by accident.
Right.
Come back to it, and he's like, I had to be in my father's house, not my father's business, or whatever. So, so on the one hand, it's possible that this author told these stories because he sort of imagined that this is what this adult Jesus, who was kind of sometimes angry and irrational, he says, well, maybe that was what he was like as a child as well.
Right.
And then there's also a sense, one of the things that I love about teaching the Infancy Gospel of Thomas in class is there's also this sense that, like, what would it look like if a 5-year-old had unlimited power? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, sort of like a thought exercise. Like, my students are like, oh yeah, my sister is 5 and she had unlimited power. She would definitely kill it. But what is that motivation? Sort of like, the apocryphal texts that are talking about Jesus' childhood and these sorts of scenes in Jesus' past that the Gospels and the New Testament don't really go into. The motivation seems to be sort of filling in the gaps, saying
right.
what might have happened, or what could this kid have been like.
So effectively, it's just folks that don't have any answers wanting answers and making them up based on
making them up, or I mean, certainly there's some of that. I think there's some folks who are just making stories up, but also I think a lot of our apocryphal texts, just like our canonical texts, are people collecting stories. And so there's this story that's been told for generations or whatever, and so takes it and and records it, and then you've got it.
Adds their fun little details.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Proto-Gospel of James? Because I think, did you call it a proto-evangelium or proto-gospel?
Yeah, so proto-gospel and proto-evangelium are the two kind of ways, and sort of it goes by a lot of different.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously I'm not a Bible scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but I have done lots and lots of reading about the Bible, of the Bible, and sort of around the Bible, and this was one that I wasn't super familiar with, and so I imagine that a lot of people that are listening or watching are likely not particularly familiar either. So can you give them maybe just like a brief synopsis and what drew you to it to want to specialize in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's always a dangerous thing to ask. Like, I'm one of the few people who specializes in this text, so it's very dangerous to ask me to talk about it, but I'll try to keep it short.
No, please, take all the time you want.
So the Proto-Evangelium, Proto-Gospel, Infancy Gospel of James, all of these refer to the same text. And it's just this fascinating, very short little text. I mean, you can read the whole thing in less than an hour. And the focus of it is on the birth, childhood of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so
Okay.
it starts with Mary's parents, Anna, who are named Anna and Joachim. And if you have any Catholic or Orthodox listeners, then they will immediately recognize those names. Those characters come from the Proto-Gospel of James. And Anna and Joachim are childless, but also pious. And so they're kind of modeled off of Elkanah and Anna, who are the parents of Samuel. And also this like common trope of like this very pious but also childless couple. So anyway, they really want a child, and so an angel comes and kind of you're going to have a child, and Anna says, I'm going to dedicate it to the service of God. Anyway, the whole text is really focused on showing this miraculous character of Mary and how just kind of of an incredible childhood she must have had, right? And we kind of asked that question, why would this author have written this text? Well, that question, right, for a text like this is, well, if Mary is the mother of Jesus, and if Jesus is God, well, certainly the mother of God must have had a pretty spectacular life. And so this author is well, she must have at least been different, right, in some ways. So this author is trying to outline all of the ways that she's different. So
Yeah.
So when Mary is born, she walks when she's like 6 weeks old, 6 months old. Her parents take her to live in the Jerusalem temple so that she won't contract any kind of ritual impurity. So anyway, there's lots of these little vignette stories about her as a child, a young person. And then there's also stories that kind of mirror what we find in the Gospels. And so the Annunciation in Luke, where the angel comes to Mary and says, you're going to have God's baby and all this stuff. And that's there. But just a fascinating little text. And so draws on some of the more familiar canonical stories, but then also kind of invents some of the stories for Mary. In terms of why I'm interested in this text and why I started studying this text, when I was a doctoral student,
just felt like it. It just felt like it.
It just felt like it. Well, no. So when I was a doctoral student, and I've told this story so many times, I'm sure it's probably getting boring for people, but I was originally, as a doctoral student, wanting to work on Luke, and that was what I was going to do. And I actually had a really hard time. I had a hard time just sort of figuring out what exactly my contribution was going to be, because like Luke and Acts, there's so much written on it, especially recently. It's become a very popular subject. So it's like, who isn't working on Acts? But then the Proto-Gospel of James was sort of tangentially related to Luke and draws from Luke and all this. So I kept running across it. And then I looked and started doing some research on it. It's like, a lot of people have really studied this. And I mean, it certainly like pops up all over the place and people have thoughts on it. There's lots of scholarship on it. But in comparison to Luke, there's just not a whole lot. And so I talked to my director and said, I think this is an area where I can kind of carve out a niche for myself. And so he said, well, what are some ideas you have? And we started talking about those. He says, yeah, I think that's interesting. And so, so my dissertation that was published on it is the second book published in English on the. So it's like, that's a very understudied text.
Wow. Yeah. So what was your dissertation about, other than the Proto-Gospel?
Proto-Gospel. Yeah, that's what it was mainly about. So really the dissertation was more about, I mean, it was sort of, I don't want to say it was using the Proto-Gospel to illustrate something else, but the dissertation was about how a text like the Proto-Gospel affects the ways that people read other things. And so, like when you're reading, the Proto-Gospel of James, and then you go back and you reread Luke, one example is so Mary's mother in Proto-Gospel is Anna, and in Luke, when Mary and Joseph bring Jesus to the temple, there's a female prophet named Anna who greets them at the temple and like embraces them. And so if you're just reading Luke, you're like, there's this random person named Anna. And if you're reading the proto-gospel, and then you're going back to Luke and you're reading those things
Interesting.
together, is this Jesus' grandmother? And I don't think Luke understands her to be Jesus' grandmother, but if you are reading both of those texts sort of in tandem with one another, then they that there's that sort of connection there. There's that kind of playfulness. And so the dissertation was about reading that text in light of all of these other sort of Greco-Roman sources, canonical sources, and figuring out what meanings the reader is generating in that process.
Yeah, so it feels like, and maybe I'm wrong here, but it feels like someone took the Gospel of Luke and was like, let me give some of these people's interesting backstories. So then you have like, it's like, I don't want to call it fan fiction because I feel like that's really disrespectful to like use that term, but like kind of like, it feels very much like that, right? Like here's this lesser known character. Let me give it her or him a backstory that connects him more, like plugs him into the main story. And so it's like you have these sort of spin-offs from the main book, to put it in more like pop culture terms, I guess, which is really interesting, especially if you're not reading it like an evangelical who has said, oh, it's not in the Bible, then get it out of here. So if you're reading it just from this like history and wanting to learn and being interested, it's fascinating.
Oh, and I would say like use the words fan fiction. Like I love that. I love it so much. So in my introduction to the dissertation, I used the concept of the reboot. So the cinematic reboot of like, so here's like, I think I talked about Batman, right? So like Batman's story begins here with, whoever, but then there's all these like Christian Bale reboots and like all of these whatever. And so no, I think fan fiction is actually a brilliant category for this and very underutilized for apocryphal studies. But I think
that's what it feels like.
Yeah.
But
and you have all sorts of examples of this. Like you have stories that are written about all of these characters who are sort of mentioned in passing, but then there's not a whole lot said about them otherwise. So like, what about the, I don't know, there's all sorts of backstories for like, the centurion who like stands by the cross when Jesus is crucified,
right?
Or like, the good thief who's crucified with him. There's just, and I think fan fiction is spot on. Yeah.
I think, so I grew up evangelical, so the Bible is what it is, and there's no changing, no additions, no subtractions, and the only stories that matter are like, there's like 20 people in the New Testament that matter, and that's it. The rest of them are just sort of like auxiliary people that are there, but like no one actually cares about their backstory or their lives or whatever. But it's something I thought about quite frequently growing up, and I didn't really have a name for it or anything like that. But all of these people had lives before Jesus, so most of them after Jesus, and all of them during Jesus that didn't revolve around Jesus. Even the 12 disciples, who certainly, followed him around, sold all their possessions, did this, that, and the other, they had interactions that weren't just between them and Jesus, right? Like, they did other things. They had friends. Like, they had other experiences. And so it's interesting, even if, at this point in my life, I don't think the Gospels are historical. I don't think anyone that's studied the Bible with any rigor really thinks that. So it's no problem for me to read sort of people's thoughts on how these lives might have gone, especially considering they live so much closer to the actual time that this happened. They'd have a much better idea of what life would look like for a sort of average centurion, right? Or average whatever person. And so even if it's not historical, even if it's not exactly what happened, I feel like it paints a fuller picture of what it could have been like, or what it may have been like, right? And that's valuable, I think.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think really, one of the things that I've sort of gravitated more towards my own kind of professional and teaching and whatever is, like, let's stop trying to ask this question of what actually happened, because that's a question that's inaccessible to us. We can't really. It just isn't. Most of this stuff just isn't accessible to us. And so, what we can talk about, though, are the texts. And so we can talk about how were people thinking about these characters? What were they doing with them? And those questions are also really interesting. And we have plenty of data, right? We have all these stories.
Right.
Like we have fan fiction about Peter, we have fan fiction about Thomas, Paul, and everyone
Right.
else. So like, how were people thinking about these characters?
I mean, isn't it the Apocrypha? Was it the Apocrypha? Or I'm thinking the Apocalypse. I'm smart. The Apocalypse of Peter, which is where we get our sort of first notions of hell and like eternal conscious torment being this really horrifying thing.
Yeah. No, it's certainly. I mean, the concepts of the sort of fiery afterlife certainly develop and take on lives of their own in the apocalypse.
Right.
So, yeah.
When you're talking, it's interesting, and I'm sort of fleshing this out in my brain now, so it might not be a one-to-one comparison, but yesterday I forgot to take my Adderall, and so I was hyperfixated on the first border conflict ever recorded, and I spent all day reading about it. Now, you probably don't see the tie-in yet, that's fine. It's between two city-states, Umma and Lagash, back in ancient Mesopotamia, and all of the writings that we have about this conflict come from the royal inscriptions of Lagash. And so when you're reading about it, all of the scholars will say, you have to remember that this is all coming from the royalty in this one place, right? So it's a propaganda of sorts. And so you also have to then think, what would the counter narrative be, right? If this person is saying A, why would they be saying that? Could it be because it really happened? Sure. Could it be because something else happened and they need to sort of support or protect their position? Yeah, that too. So again, I don't think it's a one-to-one, but it's an interesting way of thinking about it because you're saying we have these texts. So we take the text and say, okay, this is what the texts are telling us, right? Who wrote these texts? Who do we think wrote these texts? Why would they be writing these things? And what would the counter narrative potentially be for people feeling the need to say or do or write these things, right? So it's an interesting way of thinking about writing instead of just thinking like, did this actually happen? Like you said, it's more thinking about like, why would someone write this or write it this way or write it at this time? What's happening that would drive this need? But I'm going to bring the conversation back.
No, and I think that's a really, really important point. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately in terms of my own research. So I'm somebody who does a lot of literature. Right? That's my jam. Is literature. And so this last end of April, early May, I took a group of students from Ferrum to Rome, and I co-taught a course on. My course is called Magic, Myth, and Ancient Rome, and then a colleague of mine from Ferrum taught a course called An American in Rome. So she talked about the kind of influence on Roman Empire on American politics and these sorts of things. Really, really, really interesting. And it kind of evolved very early on. We started the course in DC, and we went to like the Lincoln Memorial, and we went to all these different places. The course very much started to evolve into a course on memorializing and monuments and these sorts of things. And one of the questions that we were asking when we arrived in Rome was sort of this question of when we're talking about history, who are we remembering, right? And so walking the students through, we walked them up. We were staying at the Colosseum. We walked them up to like the marketplace of Trajan, with Trajan's column, and here's the Dacian Wars and all this kind of stuff. And then there's the Victor Emmanuel Memorial and all this kind of stuff. And like these very famous men who are memorialized here. But then I took them around the back of the Victor Emmanuel Memorial and showed them the ruins of an old apartment complex, which is one of my favorite spots in Rome. Just a really, really cool, like 4 or 5 story apartment complex. And the people who lived here, we have no idea who they were. They don't tell us anything about themselves because they don't know how to write. And even if they did know how to write, the way that ancient literary culture works is if you've got somebody there who knows how to write, there's stuff that they write isn't going to be passed on for future generations because it's not worth copying. And so when we're asking this question of like, what do we know? How do we know it? History. We're only reading not only the victors, right? Because that's the whole, like, history is written by the victors, sure. But history is written by people who know how to write. And so, like, what does it look like to think about the thousands of people over however many years that apartment complex was in existence, those people who lived there and not really know anything about them at all, right? But they all lived these full lives.
Yeah. There's a word for that I can't think of. It's like sonder or something, where there's this realization that everyone around you is living these like very full lives that you know nothing about. And now obviously those people lived a long time ago, but it's the same concept of these people that like we will never know, that lived through these monumental or monumentous times in history, right. Things that we still learn about and teach about and spend decades and generations studying. And they just went about their life and had friends and families and loss and love, and we'll just never know about them, right? Much like, I mean, this is not meant to be depressing, like much like people will probably never know about a lot of us. But it's a very interesting thought experiment, because the people that we study, they're important, but it's such a limited scope. It's such a narrow sort of subject, I guess, for lack of a better term. Like, there's so much that could have been learned if we just knew what the average person was doing and not what this like very exceptional person is doing.
Well, like exceptional, educated, wealthy, like all of those things. I mean, that's who we know. Like what we know, that's who we're getting.
Right.
And so like, and it's sort of like, as somebody who does like history, it's extremely depressing for me to think about. Like how much sort of like just is just gone, and it's completely inaccessible. I had a student I teach a class called biblical archaeology, and this was years ago now. And the student, there was a student who gave a presentation. I don't really know what the point was supposed to be, but the presentation was all about how there's no archaeological evidence for the birth of Jesus. Okay. Like, and I'm not somebody who polices ideas, and I'm also not a mythicist. So I think Jesus was a historical figure.
But like, what evidence would there be?
Right. Well, and that's what I asked him at the end. I said, "Is there any archaeological evidence of your birth?" And he thought for a second. He's like, "Well, I don't know what that would look like." And I said, "Okay, so now like rewind like 2,000 years, and like what would it look like for somebody to have archaeological evidence of birth?"
Right. I mean, that's like, so someone the other day, God, I get tagged, as you can imagine, on Twitter with some of the funniest shit imaginable. And some of it's funny because it's funny, and some of it's funny because it's like, and someone was having a conversation with a Christian, and they asked the Christian, like, okay, well, maybe it wasn't asking the Christian, but the Christian effectively said, this is what it was. Yeah. He said, if they found the bones of Jesus, then I would stop being a Christian. How the hell would you know those were the bones of Jesus? Like, right. How would you know? They wouldn't know. It's like the same idea where people are like, well, there's an empty tomb, so therefore Jesus rose from the dead. Like, do y'all just drop acid and say shit? Because like there's lots of empty tombs. Like, right, there's lots of empty tombs all over the place. Like, Anyway, I digress.
Yes.
So, okay, you sent me the chapter of your book, and I was immediately drawn in by the name of the chapter because it starts off with mushrooms.
Yes.
Ancient mushrooms. Sorry, mushrooms, armies, and secrets as old as the world. And if that doesn't make you want to read the chapter, I don't know what will. And so we've sort of been talking about parts of it as we've gone along. But the main point, I believe, of the book that you're writing is a focus on the Magi, right? And so we see in the proto-evangelium of James, we have the Magi, and then we see them also in Matthew. And so I'm wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about the similarities and the differences and how those sort of might inform each other.
Yeah. So this book is it was a labor of love. I've been working on it for a long time, and it's going to come out in October of this year, pending any.
Everyone should buy it.
Everyone should buy it. I'm
Is
biased,
it available for
but
pre-order yet?
Oh, it sure is on Amazon. And
okay, I'll
and
have
also,
you tell everyone about it at the end. We'll push it.
yeah, of course. So the Magi, and this kind of ties into the whole idea of these minor characters, right? Relatively speaking, minor characters who then develop these very, very elaborate acts. And so Matthew is the only gospel that tells the story of the Magi, or the wise men who come to Jesus after he's born. And the story is, if you just stop somebody on the street and say, "Can you tell me the story of the wise men to see Jesus?" The story that they're going to tell you is a lot more than the story that actually occurs. Matthew's story is so short. I mean, it's 12 verses long, so short. And so, the Magi come from the east. They come to Jerusalem looking for the king of the Judeans, and Herod sort of sends them off to Bethlehem, and then they go on by another route. And so anyway, the whole kind of point of the book is trying to figure out, who does Matthew want his readers to understand these people?
Right.
Because I'm not one of these people who thinks Magi actually come to Jerusalem or Bethlehem or whatever. I think that Matthew either heard the story from somebody or he made it up. But it shouldn't really matter, again, because we focus on texts and what are these texts doing.
Right.
And so the story is just a fascinating story if you sit and spend some time thinking about the words that Matthew's chosen and the details, right? The star that leads them to, that leads them westward and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, that story then in Matthew gets picked up by all these other authors. The Protogospel of James is one of those authors who picks up the story and runs with it. So the way that apocryphal authors generally work with these stories, they take them and it's very boring and nonsensical to just retell a story, just copy it the way that it is. So they take the story and then they just make at least a little bit of tweaks to it. So the Protogospel of James, one of the things that this author does is emphasize the brightness of the star. The star was so bright that it outshone all of the other stars. And so one of the things that I do in this chapter that you read of the mushrooms and the secrets and all of that stuff is to say, I think that these apocryphal authors who are retelling the story of the Magi, I think that they are tweaking and amending little details to Matthew's story that sort of intensify the rhetoric of Matthew's story. So the whole point of Matthew's story is not, and I guess this is the chapter that you didn't read, but the whole point of Matthew's story, as I argue, is sort of a political. There's a political undertone to it. So the Magi are coming to Jerusalem looking for the king of the Judeans, and there's all of this sort of vocabulary that's very familiar in that first century context. Herod's title is king of the Judeans, and Herod received that title from the Senate of Rome, and so the Magi coming to Herod and saying, "We're looking for the one born king of the Judeans," is a way of them saying, "We're not looking for the one who was
appointed.
Title. We're looking for the real one." And
Herod's saying, "Herod, you're illegitimate."
Right. Well, that's exactly right. And Herod historically, and we have this from New Testament sources as well. Herod is not even Judean; he's an Idumean. And so he is not sort of even, if I can use this word, ethnically, he's not even sort of suited for this position that he's in. And so Matthew's point in telling the story of the Magi seems to be the Magi are coming to say the legitimate king is now born. and he's in Bethlehem. And so when the author of the Protogospel, James, sort of emphasizes the brightness of the star and that detail, I argue that that's sort of intensifying that rhetoric, that political rhetoric of, the star of the new king is sort of not only risen, but it's also brighter than all the other stars.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually surprised to learn a lot of that stuff about Herod. I can't remember the name of the book right now, but it's on my shelf behind me. I think it's just called like The Herods or something, but I was reading through it, and it was just so much that, unsurprisingly, I never learned in church or anywhere else for that matter. Because what you learn, again, the backstories of people are so interesting, but all you learn about Herod, at least for me in church, was that he wanted to kill all the babies, and that's abortion, and that's what's happening now. That's effectively the line, right? Like, it sounds so stupid, but the amount of times that I heard, like, presidents compared to King Herod, or, like, these, like, weird connections between, like, oh, well, there was this kind of, like, massive baby slaying when Herod was king, and now we're seeing it again, therefore Jesus is coming, like...
Oh.
That's the mushrooms part of the chapter. No. Sorry.
Well, no, and that's the thing that's really funny about, like, when you're doing, like, when you're studying a text like Matthew, like, even if we're just kind of getting out of the apocrypha and saying, let's just study the New Testament. If all you know about Herod is what you learn about him from the New Testament, then you have, like, virtually nothing. I mean, that's basically all you have, because he's alive he dies. He dies in Matthew not long after Jesus is born, and so, like, that's basically it. Like, oh, who was Herod? He was a baby killer. Well, I mean, like, there's, it's just so uncreative. But then when you start looking at these other ancient sources of, like, who was the historical Herod? I mean, was he a good ruler? I mean, like, he built a lot of stuff. There's plenty of people who didn't really have a whole lot of positive stuff to say about him. But, like, the one thing you don't find in all these other ancient sources is, like, oh, and Herod was also a baby killer. Like,
because it didn't happen.
Right. Exactly.
Sorry.
Well, no, it didn't. It didn't. And Matthew has created that story in order to draw a comparison between Herod and Pharaoh in Moses' story. So Matthew's whole point is that Jesus is a new and improved Moses. Moses 2.0 perhaps is a bit much, but sort of right. Jesus is following in Moses' footsteps. I mean, he moves to Egypt, and then he comes out of Egypt back into the land, and, like, just like Pharaoh kills all the babies, Herod also kills all the babies.
It is really mind-boggling to me. I mean, I guess it is and it isn't, because I grew up this way. But when so when I was first leading my faith, just like everybody else in the world, I read one of Bart Ehrman's books. And he said something along the lines of, like, take the 4 Gospels, put them next to each other, and just see if they match. And I was aghast. Because even though I have read these Gospels over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, I think churches have a way of harmonizing them, and so you just sort of gloss over the things that don't quite fit with what you're being told. And so this idea of Jesus, or of Joseph and Mary, going to Bethlehem for the census, okay, well then do they come back, or do they go to Egypt, right? I don't know. But it makes a lot of sense when you're saying, like, he's trying to fashion him as sort of, I don't want to say Moses reincarnate, but he's saying, like, here is this sort of titan of the faith, so sort of almost like the inventor of the faith, and here we have Jesus following in his footsteps to lend him legitimacy, because when the Gospels were being written, there wasn't a lot of legitimacy to be had for Jesus, right? It was still in the, like, newer, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong there, but, like, it's certainly, they were trying to convince people that Jesus was the legitimate Messiah.
Well, and I think Jesus as a Jewish teacher in the first century, I mean, there's lots of Jewish teachers in the first century, right? And so Jesus is one of
How do we differentiate?
Right, and so he's one of many. And the Jesus movement, I don't love that terminology, but let's go with it. The Jesus movement sort of, takes a different turn, right? And so by the time you've got Matthew writing about Jesus and trying to kind of differentiate Jesus or whatever, I mean, Matthew is trying to, Matthew's doing what a lot of authors do, which is he's telling the story in such a way that it is, legitimacy, but also, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe gravitas, right? Sort of like Jesus is doing the same sorts of things that Moses did. And so
Right.
Matthew is appropriating that story and saying, look, Jesus was born in much the same way, right? He had to escape the tyrannical ruler. And then, Moses goes up on the mountain and receives the law. Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount to Matthew and goes up on the mountain to comment on the law, whatever. And so it is a way of legitimacy, yes, but also just a way of sort of encouraging readers to interpret these characters against one another, or in light of one another, rather. And it brings Jesus to a new level for Matthew's readers. I think if he does that.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Can you tell us a little bit about the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew? I'm going to take you through all of the texts because I want people to know about them, and I want them to know about them from someone who knows.
Yeah. So the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew is probably one of the ways. So the proto-gospel of James is one of these texts that it's one of the texts that ends up on the condemned list for a number of reasons.
Banned list.
The banned books. And so it gets kind of rediscovered at some point, but the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew is one of the ways that the Proto-Gospel of James sort of survives. The Pseudo-Matthew is kind of, it incorporates a lot of the stories from the Proto-Gospel of James, and but it's the things that got the things that got Proto-Gospel of James on the condemned list aren't in. So it's it's one of those texts. Pseudo-Matthew is a very, very influential text about Mary, childhood of Mary, birth of Mary, and written in Latin rather than Greek. Extremely influential, though. And Magi also appear in that. I'm guessing you're asking about this chapter as well.
I just sort of looked through the text that you mentioned, and again, I'm not a Bible scholar, but I have a fairly good, at least, grasp on what's out there. And some of these I hadn't really even heard of, so I was like, maybe I don't have as good of a grasp as I thought. And so I feel like there's probably some that also my listeners or watchers haven't heard of, and I think they're really interesting, and how they inform the Gospels, or how the Gospels inform them, however you want to look at it, is also very interesting. If not only to learn about the texts, but also to think about the people who wrote these texts and why they might have been doing that in their time and place.
Yeah. No, and so I'm thinking right now, because I just wrote a book on the Magi, I'm thinking about the Magi and Pseudo-Matthew. Two really, really interesting things. One of them is that in Pseudo-Matthew, the Magi give their gifts of the incense, the gold, and the myrrh, but then they each give Jesus a gold coin, which is just really nobody really knows what's going on there. They give each a gold coin.
It's like when my grandma gave me a bond when I was born. It's like, just leave that for a while.
Forget about this for a bit. But they give him a gold coin, and so so this very evidence of this kind of tampering with the tradition of it wasn't just these three gifts; it was these gold coins as well. But then there's also this really fascinating scene in Pseudo-Matthew where Joseph and Mary are on their way to Egypt with Jesus, and they stop at a cave, and dragons come out of the cave. Just
Dude, It's
not
not
part of the Magi story, so I didn't really talk about it. Yeah, but like dragons. Yeah.
And what happened? Inquiring minds need to know.
I'm trying to remember now. I'm trying to remember if the dragons. So one of the things that happens, and this is like going back to the dissertation, like when we read these texts, like all of them sort of tend to collapse into our brains.
Yeah,
I'm
that
trying
makes
to
sense.
remember I'm trying to remember if the dragons come out of the cave and then they bow to Jesus or something like this.
That would make. I
But
assume
it's
they
just
didn't
it's
like
just
breathe
wild.
fire and incinerate them. So
No, they didn't. They don't. No, nobody dies though. Yeah.
no, only in the infancy gospel are people getting murked.
Right, and then resurrected. Right, it's sort of a.
Sorry about that. Just a little temper, but don't worry about it. I can always bring you back.
Right.
Okay, the last text that I will ask you about, and then I want to ask a couple of fun questions. Not that these haven't been fun, but is the revelation of the Magi. Because that was something I had not heard of. And in looking at your chapter, it looks like it's like one page, or like one, it's very brief.
So the revelation of the Magi is just fascinating. So this is another very, very understudied text. It's not one page. It's quite a bit longer, but it's one manuscript. So there's only one copy.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's one copy of it from way back.
It says right there is a lengthy account. My eyes just went over that. I like to skip words, make my own stuff up.
I'm second guessing all of my framing now. I got to go back and like change the stuff. So, but no, it's a long story, but it's only found in one manuscript. And it's
Got it.
A Syriac manuscript in the Vatican. But it's another just fascinating text about the Magi. There's 12 of them. Correctly, there's 12 of them. And in all of the other stories, there's 3. Matthew doesn't actually number them, but all of the stories that do number them and name them, there's 3. And so in this text, there's a dozen, and the whole revelation of the Magi is told from the perspective of the Magi. So it's all a first-person account. Like, we did this, we did this, we did this. So it's just really, really interesting. And this is where the mushrooms come in, because they are, it's just wild. So they are a group of, they're sort of like priestly figures, but they live in this mythical land of Shir, way out in the east. And they, all of this stuff sounds like made up names. They live at the base of the Mountain of Victories and the Cave of Treasures of Hidden Mysteries and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it reminds me of Little Pilgrim's Progress.
Yeah, right. Like Lord of the Rings or something like that, So it's just really funny. So so the story goes that they're like doing this ritual bath that they do every year, and they see the star that descends from the heavens, and it goes into the Cave of Treasures, and so they follow it into the Cave of Treasures, and then the star in this text is actually Jesus himself, and so he says, follow me to Bethlehem.
I will make you fishers of men. Just kidding.
Right, something like that. They take their gifts from the Cave of Treasures, and then they follow the star and everything. And the whole way they're kind of describing what the star is doing. They're describing what they're thinking and all of that stuff. And anyway, the mushrooms come in because the star multiplies their provision. The star multiplies their food. Now, there's one very easy explanation for this, is that the star, if it's Jesus, the star is actually doing a lot of the things that Jesus is doing in the Gospels. So, like food is one of the things that Jesus does in all 4 Gospels. So
that's what popped to mind. But
yeah, exactly, right? So, we didn't have to worry about food because the star was made for food. Now, my friend and colleague Brent Landau, who is the first, he's the first person who translated the Revelation of Magi into English, which is awesome. And his little book is great on it. He wrote an book chapter years ago now, on whether the food, quote unquote, that the star is multiplying is just food, or whether it's something else.
Oh
So,
my gosh. Brett
yeah.
Landau, please come talk to me. This sounds right up my alley. Thank you.
He's on Twitter as well.
Well, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, and the whole so they're traveling along, and the star is
Or they're still in the bath eating mushrooms. I don't know. It could be.
Well, and that's a great point, right? I mean, are they really on the road, or are they just
It's like astral projecting?
in the
Sorry, I'm
spa,
going to stop
right?
now.
Yeah. No, and so they're eating this, and Brent calls it the star food, right? Sort of like the star is multiplying their food, and but then the really funny thing, which gets me sort of thinking about this as like mushrooms, is when they come back from Bethlehem and they come to Shear, the land of Shear, and all of the people are gathering around and like, what did you see? Tell us about what you saw. And so the Magi are like, yeah, this is what we saw. This is what we did. And then they say, why don't you have some of this food? And just eat some of this food that the star multiplied.
Try it. You'll
and
like
people
it.
eat the food. Yeah, but the people eat it, and then they start having visions of Jesus. And so Brent is like, okay, so clearly, I mean, or maybe not clearly, but I mean, like provocatively, perhaps this is referencing
It doesn't seem. It seems only provocative because folks don't want to think that people do drugs or have ever done drugs because we live in this very like puritanical society now. But the fact of the matter is, how do you think people found out that you could hallucinate when you ate certain things? You know, they ate them. Yeah. And if they had fun eating them, they probably ate them again. Like,
right. Yeah,
especially,
so there's a whole trial in this.
I would imagine if you're like a spiritual leader at certain times in certain places, I mean, you can even go, like something I always think about is like scrying in ancient Egypt, right? Where you go and you sort of induce this other sort of state of mind. I'm not saying that correctly. Where you go, you sit in a very dark room, you weren't allowed to eat beforehand, you're just staring in a piece of onyx or something where you can see a reflection, and then you just sit there for hours on end until your brain creates something, right? So I'm sure that in other places and times, absolutely, people did hallucinogenics. Do I know that these people did them for sure? No, but I don't think it's like really provocative to think that they might have. It's just because we're told that these people are holy or something, and we've decided what that means.
Right. Well, and I think that's key, right? I mean, it's sort of like, yeah, we've decided what that means. So, like, here we have this story, which, I mean, and I'll just say, I think Brent's article is fantastic on this, and I think he's spot on. I mean,
I will be reading.
It seems to be a very clear story of like ritual drug use, and I mean, I'm not gonna go beyond that and say like, and here's what it all looked like. But I mean, it seems to be that's what the story is sort of reflecting. It's like this is a community, or this is an author that had an experience of people using drugs to do something related to their religious beliefs. And and I mean, we have plenty of evidence of that in the ancient world. It doesn't really make any sense to say like, well, the followers of Jesus wouldn't have done that because they wouldn't have used it.
Yeah, because we've decided drugs are bad, okay? So they also knew that. Okay, speaking of drugs, no, I'm just kidding, not speaking of drugs. We talked a little bit before we hopped on about theobros on the internet, and how they're somewhat invincibly ignorant, and I thought that was such a fantastic term. Anyone that spent any amount of time with me knows that, like, these people, I will not name any names, probably, are, like, the bane of my existence, because it drives me nuts sometimes to think about how much knowledge is out there and how much there is to know, and how interesting all of it is, and yet these folks just want to believe the most boring, mundane, sort of uncreative stuff in the world. And you brought up an interesting point that I want to let you talk about, is like this sort of incestuous cycle of let's say the Baptist seminarian world.
Hypothetically.
Hypothetically.
Just speaking, we have to have an example. Yeah, it could be anyone, but yeah, sure. It's B is up in the alphabet, so we can go with that. Yeah.
I just have a chip on my shoulder after all the abuse that's come out, so I genuinely don't care if their feelings are hurt. But for your sake, it's hypothetical.
Sure.
Yeah, for legal purposes, this is a joke.
Yeah. We're not even recording right now, I think. Yeah.
No, we're wrong.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I think, so invincibly ignorant is one of my favorite phrases to use to describe a whole host of people. I use it a lot for politics in this country because I think that I'm not one of these like both sides people, but I think that there's invincibly ignorant people who are everywhere, and I think the invincibly ignorant person is somebody who has decided what they think about something, and they see. I think there's a sense for some that changing their mind or amending a position would be seen as
losing.
Yeah, losing or like, yeah. I don't know. I mean,
I think one thing that's important to think about in these situations, sorry to interrupt you, but just as someone who grew up kind of like this, I think part of the reason they don't want to change their mind is because in many denominations, including my own, which is non-denominational but evangelical, they tell you that if one thing in the Bible is wrong,
right,
then it's all wrong. Then you can't trust any of it, right? So you go into this place where you have to be just aggressively defensive about every little thing, and you cannot cede any ground, because you're taught if you cede any ground, then your entire faith goes out the window.
Right. Well, and I think that's I think there's a sense that like being wrong or ceding any ground is like if you're dealing with something like politically, right? It's like, oh, I've changed my mind about this. It's like a sign of weakness, maybe, or something like that. Stupid, maybe. People change their minds on the basis of new evidence all the time, and they should, right? I mean, that's something like if you are presented with new evidence, and there's this video clip, right, of Fauci saying at the start of the COVID pandemic, I don't really think masks are going to do much, and I've had students before have been like, why do we have to wear masks in the classroom? Fauci here said that masks aren't going to do much. Well, I mean, but then he changed his mind on the basis of new evidence, and that doesn't mean he's stupid. That means that he's a scientist.
It's called the scientific method.
Right.
Follow me for more hot tips.
Yeah. Bravando. So, but no, I think when you're dealing with things like when you're dealing with theology, and especially when you're dealing with the types of theology that we're talking about now, hypothetically, of course, I think that there's a sense and I'm kind of coming at this from an outsider perspective. I mean, I was raised Methodist. I went to church almost every Sunday. My church growing up was wonderful. It really was. I mean, it was actually a legitimately good place.
Churches certainly can be. Unfortunately,
they can be.
Don't seem to be very often.
And well, for every one of mine, there's 100 others that are bad. And but I sort of say that to say, like, I don't have any sort of like animosity towards my religious upbringing at all.
Right.
Now my where I'm at right now looks very different than where I was as a kid. But anyway, I think coming at this from an outsider perspective of like, growing up in a relatively, I'll just use the word boring. I mean, it was a great place, but it was also very boring. Like I don't have any of these experiences, like anyone trying to indoctrinate stuff. But looking at some of these folks, and I have students, right, who are coming out of holiness traditions or Pentecostal or Baptist or whatever, and they come to my classes and they'll say, and they'll be really, really nervous about something that we'll talk about in class. I'll give them, one of the very early in the semester of my Old Testament class. I'll tell them you're going to read the two creation stories of Genesis side by side, and you're going to note the similarities and the differences.
No.
Wait. There's two stories? No, there's just one story. Like, no, there's two. And put them side by side and note the differences. They see that as very, very dangerous, right? And they see that as sort of if there's differences, then that means that they can't both be right?
Yeah, spoiler alert, neither of them are right, but yes.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. That's what I tell them. So on Thursday, what we're going to talk about is that neither of these stories are actually correct in the sense of thinking about it, but they're both theologically valuable for what they're trying to do, right? It's sort of
right.
That's what we're going to talk about. But no, I think that in many ways, the more kind of biblicist Christian traditions have backed themselves into a corner by this sense that if any piece is dislodged, the whole thing crumbles, and that's I mean I guess the whole thing crumbles then, right? Because if we're going back to the Gospels, Jesus is crucified on a completely different day, possibly a different year in the Gospel of John than he's crucified in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So if one detail doesn't fit, then the whole thing crumbles.
Bye bye.
I guess the whole thing crumbles.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I guess as somebody who sort of grew up in a religious setting and then sort of was trained very much in a kind of religious setting, and then sort of, I guess I still consider myself religious in some respects, but very, very differently and not really recognizable to my younger self, probably. Right. But I don't know. I'm just somebody who's if the facts are there, if the data is there, you need to deal with it. And if dealing with it means I no longer believe anything because this is whatever, then that's fine.
That's fine, and it's also a flaw in sort of, maybe not a flaw, but so I recently had Dan McClellan on. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Oh, yes.
Hi, Dan. He's the best. So I had him on, and he said something really interesting, because as most people know, he's the scripture supervisor for the LDS Church. He is a practicing LDS, and his entire motto, I guess, is data over dogma. And what's interesting to me that he said was that folks have made their religious beliefs so rigid that they can't withstand any real force. It's they've put this is my religion, this box. He said it much more eloquently. Sorry, Dan. He created this box, and I need everything to fit inside of it, right? But at a certain point, you're getting more data and more information that can fit inside of it. And so, you either have to open up that box, or it's going to collapse from all the weight pressing in on it. And so, making your belief system that rigid can also make it very, very weak. And it's frustrating and also quite sad to watch it play out, because I know lots of folks with very rich religious practices and beliefs that are actually not assholes. So it can be done. It can be done. Yeah. And I think that for some people, spirituality is very important, and I would not begrudge anyone's spirituality so long as they're not harming other people with it. But also, you are being harmful if your spirituality is not based in maybe not spirituality, but if you're disregarding facts, there's a problem. There's a problem.
Well, right, and that's the thing. We're talking here about let's just keep it on the level of facts. If you're in a position where your faith or beliefs or whatever is requiring you to literally shut your eyes and say, I do not want to look at that. I'm not gonna acknowledge that that exists. Well, like, I think about, like, you know, yeah, and Dan is wonderful. And for this reason, right? I'm like looking at the data. So like, and I'm sitting in my house right now thinking about, the things that could go wrong. Like there's all these water pipes up in the walls and the ceilings and everything, right? So let's say that I have a like a leaky pipe somewhere. Like I find a leaky pipe in my basement, right? And there's this pipe that's just drip, 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 dripping. And I say, and that's a fact, right? Like I go down there, I say the floor is wet. I see the water coming out of this pipe, and this pipe is leaking. Well, I have two options, really. Two reasonable options. I can either figure out a solution to fix this pipe, and which is in fact leaking, or I can just say, like, you know what? I'm just gonna, yeah, I'm just gonna, like, we're just gonna leave this alone. Like, I'm just gonna ignore it. And maybe I even put a bucket underneath, right? Like maybe you put a bucket, and that fixes the leak temporarily because it keeps the leak from, like, destroying the floors.
Right.
But then the leak starts speeding up, and the leak starts, water and all of this stuff. You see where I'm going with this, right? Like,
right.
A leaky pipe in your house is something that is like, this pipe is leaking. I can see it. If you ignore it, you can ignore it for a while, and you could probably even ignore it inevitably, but it's going to cause lots and lots and lots of problems.
Right.
And then you're going to have to deny other facts, like, hey, there's a moldy smell coming from the basement. Well,
that's math.
Yeah, exactly. And so my
this
approach,
weird poisoning.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh my gosh, I'm developing, I've got this upper bronchial, like, whatever. It's like, well,
what could be happening?
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, the thing with, yeah, I wish, and I have this privilege of being able to walk students through this process in my biblical studies classes, saying, some of you, if you're coming to this class like super, super familiar with biblical text, some of this stuff might be unsettling to you. And I'm not somebody who's going to, like, ram all this stuff down your throat. All we're going to be doing is actually just reading stories. And when you read the stories and you sort of read them with an eye towards, like, detail, whatever,
what they say,
then you notice things, right? And so I tell them, and I do firmly believe this. My goal in my classes is definitely, absolutely, 100% not to destroy their faith. I have no interest in doing that whatsoever. But I do tell them, and I'm very explicit about this, that if you can't ask questions about your faith, then it's not a faith that's worth having. And if it is a faith worth having, like if you're saying, yeah, this is something that's important to me, whatever, I'm going to ask questions. Well, asking questions of your faith is not heretical.
Sacrilegious.
Yeah, it isn't. And so, and if anyone tells you, like, no, you shouldn't be asking questions, that's dangerous. No, like, hey, there's this little drip coming out of the pipe. What can we do with that? Well, you can do something. You can fix it, whatever. And and so I have a lot of students who take that very, very seriously, and they say, yeah, I've asked a lot of questions about my faith. And, I do have some students who come to me after a semester. They'll say, I'm completely done with organized religion or whatever. Like, that's fine. That's
if you got to that yourself, then okay.
Yeah. If you got to that yourself, that's fine. I had one student who came up to me, like, after the first week of class and was like, I am an atheist. Like, that's fine. That's fine. I'm a little bit hesitant to, like, claim that I did that in a week. But
some people just react more quickly when you've been force fed something your whole life and told what it says, because that's happened to me. I was always just told what the Bible said. So even when I was reading it on my own, I was reading it with this lens of what I was told that it said. When you get to a place or a class or a person or whatever that's saying, like, let's just look at what it actually says and let's go line by line and point the things out. It can happen real quick.
Right.
Real quick.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like maybe that is that, it isn't so much like, you grew up with somebody telling you what it says, and then you got into a classroom and somebody like me is telling you what it says. And in fact, what's happening in my classroom is that you're actually simply reading it, making a judgment for yourself, and you're going, oh wow, that's absolutely what it says. But I have students who just run the gamut of this sort of like, what is the effect of education on faith? There's some of my students who they lose their faith, and it's sort of, but also the faith that they've lost is a faith that was very built on very, very shoddy ground, I suppose.
Yeah.
Sort of like, people not being terribly honest with them. And but I've had plenty of students who have said, like, knowing how to read these texts responsibly has made me a more faithful person. And I think that's great, right? I mean, it's sort of, that's good. I don't, but yeah, I think you follow the data, follow the facts. And
follow the facts. Just follow the facts.
Yeah, exactly.
And on that note, thank you so much for being here with me tonight. I had a great time. I never quite know where conversations are going to go, but I always find that at the end, I am overjoyed with the things that we discussed and the things that I learned. Yeah. And I hope that folks that are watching feel the same. I think that they will. But before we go, can you tell people where they can find you, how they can pre-order your book, and anything you might have coming up?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter is probably the best way to find me, although if you Google my name, I think I'm the only person named this in the world. So
your humanities page will come up.
My humanities page, okay, that's good. That's got some stuff, but the Magi book that I'm really excited about, that I've been working on for a while, is called The Magi: Who They Were, How They've Been Remembered, and Why They Still Fascinate. And it's published by Fortress Press, and it's coming out. Publication date is sometime in October of this year. So if you pre-order it through Amazon, it'll be in your mailbox sometime in November. So
amazing. And we will put all of this in the show notes. So we'll link to the book, a link to your Twitter, a link to your humanities page, whatever you'd like. Everyone, please go pre-order the book. I think you will find it fascinating. I have, from the chapter I read. Go follow Dr. Vanden Eykel, Erik, whatever you'd like to go by. I didn't even ask at the beginning.
No, it's all good.
And don't forget to do all the normal stuff, like, subscribe. As Vice Rhino says, hit the like button so baby Jesus will cry. Or maybe so he'll fight with his friends and kill them, but then he'll bring him back to life. I don't know. I don't know. But on that note, thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye, y'all.